Hello, my name is Sarah Steiner, and I'm the social media editor for college and research libraries. I'm really excited that you could join us today to watch this recording. We're going to be chatting today about a recently released college and research libraries article entitled The Impact of Library Resource Utilization on Undergraduate Students' Academic Performance. And we have both the authors of that study here today to chat with us, Feli Chitain-Kat, who's the Institutional Research Analyst for the Office of the Provost at Nazarbayev University, and Jennifer Jones, who's the Assessment and User Experience Librarian in the University Library at Georgia State University. So if you've sat in on one of these college and research libraries fora in the past, you know that we normally do them live. Unfortunately, it wasn't in the cards for this particular session, but we're excited to bring this to you today. And you can still submit questions to the authors. I'm going to put up a bit of information so you can see. We do have a web form where you can submit questions, and the URL is there at the top. And both the authors, Feli and Jennifer, would be happy to hear from you at their email addresses at work. So you can go ahead and shoot them a note there if you'd like to ask them any questions. And the article itself is linked in the text underneath the video box area in the YouTube. So you should be able to take a look at the actual article right now if you'd like to pull that up, or after we watch the session. All right, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and we'll launch into our questions. So the first one is, please tell us a little bit about your study, including its structure and findings.
I'll go ahead and address this question, and then Jennifer can add to it. So basically, the purpose of our study was to examine how library resource usage impacts students' academic performance in the first semester. And in terms of the structure, we have an introduction in which we discuss briefly how colleges and universities are increasingly seeking to foster student success, mainly due to both internal and external pressures to demonstrate their worth. And then we have a review of the literature in which we place the study within the context of previous studies conducted in the United States, but also internationally. And then we presented a conceptual model to guide our study. And for this particular study, we use Alexander Astin's input environment output model, which helped us conceptualize the study, but also understand better the relationship among elements or among variables. And finally, we presented our methodology, including the description of the sample. We had almost 9,000 first-time, full-time undergraduate students included in this study. And then we discussed the data sources. We'll get into that a little bit, into details a little bit later. And then we also present variables and an interesting research design that we use for this particular study. And finally, we presented results and discussed them, as well as highlighted the study limitations. And very briefly, in terms of the finding, we found that overall library resource usage was associated with first-term GPA. And this was regardless of how library resources and services usage was operationalized and defined. This is very briefly what we found, but we'll get into details as our discussion goes on.
Thanks. I don't think I have anything to add. I think that's a great outline.
Perfect. Thank you. So what motivated you to undertake this study in the first place?
I'll start with that, and then I'll hand it over to Feli if he has anything he'd like to add. I was really interested and intrigued and inspired by the impact studies being accomplished at the University of Minnesota libraries. And the researchers there have done a really great job documenting their findings on a website, Library Data and Student Success. And I was following what they were doing for a while. And in addition to that, our Dean of Libraries at the time was very interested as well herself, and she really supported my pursuing an impact study. And she was really interested in the findings as well. And around the same time, Georgia State University had made a commitment to the Complete College Georgia program, which was an effort to confer more undergraduate degrees by the year 2020. And that made me think about, how might the library be contributing to student success, whether it's improved GPA or progression, retention, graduation. These sorts of questions were on my mind when that Complete College Georgia initiative was announced. And so that was another factor. And then I'm always, as the assessment person in my library, I'm always asking what I call the and then what question. So I might hear someone in the library talking about, oh, well, we have 50 more students attending these workshops than we did last year, which sounds great, but and then what? So what was the result of those additional 50 students attending? So I'm always looking for that last piece of things improve or things increase, but what does that tell us? What kind of impact is that having on the lives of students or researchers or faculty, for example? So these are the kinds of questions on my mind, and that's why I was motivated to pursue this. And then I contacted the Office of Institutional Research, and they suggested that Feli might be interested in working with me. And I was very fortunate that he was interested in working with me. So I'm not sure if Feli wants to add anything, but those were kind of my primary motivations for pursuing this.
I think that's very well said. And I will just add that I was interested when I was working at Georgia State University within the Office of Institutional Research. My interest was more on how academic support services impact students' academic performance. And before we started this library study, I had conducted another study that looked at the impact of centralized advising on students' academic performance. So when Jennifer came to the Office of Institutional Research with this suggestion, I thought, that's great. That's really what I'm interested in, because I know the library is a very important academic support service. So I was greatly interested in this particular study and was glad we were able to conduct it.
Excellent, thank you. Tell us a little bit about the data sources you used in this study and how you integrated them in order to answer the research question.
Okay, I will start off on this one, and then Jennifer can also discuss. And for this particular study, we used two main data sources. We used the library information system, and we used Georgia State University data warehouse. Maybe I will let Jennifer talk briefly about the library information system and the kind of data that we used from the library, and then I will discuss the university data warehouse and briefly talked about how we merge these two data sets.
Sure. So we looked at 3 library use data points. One was workstation logins. So students, we have over 400 desktop computers in the library, and for a student to use one, they have to log in using what's called their campus ID, which is their unique campus username and password combination. We use lab stats to manage our computers in the library, so we were able to harvest the workstation login data from that system. We also looked at group study room reservations. The library has over 60 group study rooms that are reservable by students using an online system. We used to use Open Room. We've since moved to LiveCal. But anyway, the student must make an online reservation using the same campus username and password combination. So we were able to track that information about group study room reservations. And then finally, we looked at research clinic attendance. So during the semesters that research clinics were offered, and research clinics were kind of focused, targeted library instruction sessions marketed to particular groups. And students could choose to attend any of these research clinics. It wasn't exactly modeled like library instruction, slightly different. But librarians tracked attendance to these research clinics by requesting that attendees swipe their campus ID cards using portable magnetic swipe readers. So we captured attendance at these research clinics in that way.
And then we also obviously used Georgia State University data warehouse. The Office of Institutional Research had access to the university data warehouse, and that's where basically data on students like demographic characteristics, test scores, academic records, and tons and tons of other pieces of information are stored. So what we did in OIR was extract students' demographic characteristics and academic records, financial aid information, and housing, whether or not the student lived on campus. So we extracted this data and then merged students' record, academic record, with the data that the library had supplied. And using complex procedures. And so we merged these two data sets using the Stata statistics software. And then we defined the treatment variable, which was library usage. And this one was derived from the library information system. And then what we call the dependent variable, academic performance, was derived from the university data warehouse. And also the control variables that we used are students' demographic characteristics and financial aid situation and housing arrangements. All these variables were also extracted from the university data warehouse. So we merged these two data sources using Stata statistics package, and then we're able to conduct the analysis.
You touched on this a little, but what were your most significant findings?
I will say that the most significant finding that we came up was that given two students with similar background characteristics, because our study design allowed us to construct what we call treatment and control group. So we constructed two groups that had similar background characteristics. So in one group, you have students who use the library resources or services at a given level. This is the treatment group. And in the control group, we have students who did not use the library resources or services at that particular level. So given two students with similar background characteristics, we found that the student who used library resources at a given level had a higher term GPA compared to his or her counterpart who did not use the library resource or service at that particular level. And what was particularly interesting was this finding was consistent across the library resources and services that we used. The impact was small, but it was meaningful. So it was not a negligible impact. It was small but meaningful, regardless of how library resources were operationalized.
That's great. Thank you. Jennifer, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I would just, I guess I would just throw in that, but Felly pretty much mentioned this already, that it was true for usage of all three of the identified library resources and at all levels of usage too. So that was exciting.
Which one of those resources and services had the biggest impact?
So Jennifer mentioned that we looked at three types of resources: library workstations, study rooms, and then research clinics. So what we found was that use of study rooms had the biggest impact. So the average GPA for students who used study rooms was 25% of a standard deviation above the mean. I know that sounds a little bit too technical, but it was 25% of a standard deviation above the mean compared to the average for students who did not use study rooms. So what this tells us, in other words, is that the average student who used study rooms had a GPA that exceeded the GPA of 60, about 62% of the student in the control group. So in other words, study room usage had the highest impact, and then this was followed by research clinics, and then library workstations in second and third position.
What makes your study unique relative to other previous studies that are similar?
Okay, I will discuss this one, and Jennifer can add to it. I think what really makes our study unique relative to other studies is the use of the quasi-experimental design. So we use something called propensity score matching, which we use to minimize what is known as self-selection bias. So if you look at previous studies, you will see that they did not tackle the issue of self-selection bias. When students use library resources, they are not randomly assigned to using library resources or not using library resources. So students make a decision whether or not to go to the library and use any particular resource or service. So there is an issue of self-selection involved in the process. So what we did through our research design was use propensity score matching, which is basically the probability of using the library. And then we use this to construct treatment and control groups that were similar on background characteristics. Previous studies did not take that into consideration, and previous studies did not take into consideration the fact that, so if you have students using library resources and others not using library resources, when you estimate the impact of library resources on academic performance, that impact may be biased because you might have the same variables that influence students' decision to use the library, and those same variables might also influence academic performance. So if that's the case, then the impact your estimate might be biased. So what we did was really try to construct two groups with similar background characteristics and then estimate the impact for library resources. And there is no study that has done that in the past. And finally, the other thing that makes our study unique is the use of what is called effect size to really judge whether or not the effect that we found was meaningful. Because in many cases, I mean, you can find that the impact is statistically significant, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is meaningful in practice. So we went beyond statistical significance to really look at the effect and judge whether or not the effect that we were observing was meaningful in practice. So those are the two things that really make, I think, our study unique.
Excellent. Jennifer, anything you'd like to add?
Well, I would add, and this is obvious based on what Feli said, but we were looking at the usage habits of individuals and not the usage habits of a group. We were looking at a cohort exactly. We were looking at tracking individuals' usage, and that's fairly new in libraries and in student support services too. A lot of earlier studies have looked at the habits of maybe a cohort of first-time freshmen, for example, or first-time students. But we're, and libraries really traditionally don't look at individual level usage. We tend to wipe records of what students are doing in the library for privacy concerns. So we were looking at individual level usage, what I think is not truly unique to the study, but is becoming, it's becoming more mainstream, I guess, in impact studies. But in library studies, looking at the individual user until fairly recently has not been something that's been done. So that's kind of just something I wanted to point out.
Excellent. What challenges did you face in conducting this study that you think other people might like to be aware of?
I'll mention a very practical thing, and Feli probably has quite a few from the methodology side, some challenges. An example is that originally we wanted to incorporate data on individuals who engaged in one-on-one research consultations with librarians. This is not a usage point that we collect in this library. So a library patron will make an appointment or even drop in on a subject librarian, for example, and meet with them one-on-one. And we wanted to track these individual meetings. And so we asked the librarians who were engaged in consultations to track the user data. So to ask for the user for a piece of identifying information so we could track these consultations. This was requesting that librarians do their work differently. And it's hard, very difficult, a big challenge to ask people to work differently. So it could be a major challenge for other libraries as well. It was for us, and ultimately so little consultation data was collected that we could not rely on this as a usage point for tracking. So just things like that. And I'll probably talk about this a little more later on, but if you're just starting out and considering a study such as this, go with the data that you already collect rather than asking individuals, especially, and employees to change how they work a little bit. So that was one of the challenges just from the practical side.
Mm-hmm. And from the methodological side, there were obviously a few challenges. And one of those had to do with merging the two data sources. As we mentioned, we used library data and institutional records from the university data warehouse. So the initial data set that we received from the library was huge. It had like more than 20,000 unique records, students, staff, and faculty combined, for literally hundreds of thousands of records. So the challenge was we were only interested, of course, in students, first-time, full-time students. So we had no way of knowing which ones among these individuals were students and which ones were faculty or staff. So it was a very challenging issue. Luckily, we did have, the library included a user ID. So we used that user ID and extracted student information from the university data warehouse, and then merged the two data sets, and then deleted individuals who were not students. That's faculty members and staff. So and then we had a data set of around maybe 100,000 records, but we still needed to determine which students to include in the study and which ones to delete. And then we went through another complicated process of determining which ones among those students were first-time, full-time students. And then in the end, we ended up with a data set of roughly around 9,000 students. So the merging was very, very challenging, in fact. And the other challenging aspect was the complexity of the study. If you just look at the tables, you'll notice that we have lots of tables in our articles. And the reason is we defined library resource usage in 6 different ways. So which means that any analysis that we conducted in this particular study, we had to run it 6 times. So we had to come up with 6 models every time. So the study involved like very, very complex analysis, lots of analysis. And the other challenge was we were using propensity score matching to come up with treatment and control groups that were similar to background characteristics. So that was not an easy thing to do. So we had to come up with a good model that predicted students' use of library services. And that was the starting point. Predict students' use of library services, and then use the result of that prediction to define treatment and control groups. And it was a challenge coming up with a good model that really defined treatment and control groups. And it took quite a lot of analysis in order to come up with a model that looked about right. So those are the methodological challenges that we had to face in this particular study.
Sure, thank you. So for other librarians who are interested in using this study as sort of a stepping stone, what recommendations do you have for them in terms of changes we could make or additional research ideas?
I will start this, and Jennifer can also comment on it. I think from a methodological perspective, I think that one thing that would be interesting to do is track the same cohort of students across time. Here, obviously, we use 3 cohorts of students, but we look at the use of the library during the first academic term. So what will be interesting is to track the same students multiple times, maybe each semester for a number of years, and then look at whether or not the impact of library resource usage is consistent or whether it changes over time. This will be a longitudinal study, and we know that longitudinal studies are some of the best designs because they get closer to uncovering the causal effect. And also now, in terms of topic, one thing that I think future studies might be interested in doing is to investigate the mechanisms by which use of library resources and services impact student outcomes. This is something that we did not do in our study. For instance, we found that using library workstations has an impact on students' academic performance. But we don't know by what mechanisms that happens. We know that students can do a lot of things while using library resources. They may spend time chatting with friends on Facebook, or spend time doing actual academic work. So it will be interesting for future studies to really investigate this issue and examine more like the mechanisms through which the library impacts students' academic performance. And the same is true with research clinics and study rooms and so on. I don't know if Jennifer would like to add something.
I'll just add that I recommend, and I mentioned this previously, if you're considering some kind of usage study, first focus on the data that you or your library collects already. Don't attempt to identify a dozen different usage points and how these might be tracked. Perhaps start with what is already collected automatically through things like workstation login data, as an example, one of the things we collected. I would recommend partnering with experts on campus. So if you don't have access to the data warehouse, locate the office on your campus that does, and find others like those in the Office of Institutional Research who have the technical and expertise to help you with such a study. Specialized expertise is invaluable, and if there are others on your campus who have this knowledge, then you need to tap into that. I would also recommend connecting your research to what's going on your campus. So if there's a push on your campus, for example, to improve the 6-year graduation rate or improve the time to graduation, maybe you can look at whether library users are more likely to graduate in a specified period of time. And I would recommend that because campus administrators are more likely to take notice of your results if you're tying your study to campus priorities, strategic goals, and things of that nature. So those are just kind of some general recommendations that I would make if you're considering a similar study.
Excellent, thank you. So how were your study findings disseminated and received at your institution? And what actions, if any, have been taken as a result?
Well, I'll mention that the findings, of course, have been shared extensively within the library, and they have been shared somewhat on campus. I'm going to be very honest and say that the response has largely been, well, of course, library users have better GPAs than non-library users. But, of course, we cannot make that assumption. But now we have evidence to support that assumption. We've made the paper obviously is freely available online through college and research libraries. We've put it in Georgia State's institutional repository as well. Recently, we've been discussing with enrollment services at Georgia State, the library has, how we might include library use data and the university's predictive analytics system, which is used for advisement purposes. So can we get library use data points into that system to help advisors in advising students? And I think that these findings are making this integration more of an easy sell. So it's kind of, we can mention these results and people are listening more and saying, oh, well, if you have these library use data elements and we could perhaps import them into this larger system to help students and to predict how they might succeed. People on campus seem to be taking a little more notice when we can point to results such as these. I think we haven't done this, but I think a fun way to disseminate the results might be to use them in some kind of marketing plan. Did you know that if you do this, then you are more likely to have a higher term GPA? So I think it would be fun to incorporate the results in ways like that as well, to market them to students and say, a successful student at Georgia State looks like this and has these characteristics. And I think it would be kind of a fun way to market student success to the students on campus.
Great idea. Anything you'd like to add, Felly?
I think Jennifer addressed that very well. Obviously, I left Georgia State University a while ago, and it's interesting to hear Jennifer's perspective on what happened after that. So, and I do agree that incorporating findings into marketing or student orientations might be an interesting thing.
Okay. So what are your next steps, if any, with this research?
Well, at Georgia State, I've been talking to 2 faculty members in the College of Business who are interested in continuing this research. They would also like to incorporate some other student services variables, so kind of a more complete picture, as I mentioned just a minute ago, about what a successful student at Georgia State looks like. What kinds of characteristics do these students have? Do they use the library and use the library at these different resources at these different levels, and do they also use the Student Rec Center, and just looking at different student services and how those might work together. And we're considering other use variables like off-campus logins, desk interactions, library instruction, attendance, and things like that, incorporating some other library use elements. Georgia State is, as of today, it's official. Georgia State has consolidated with Georgia Perimeter College, which is a 2-year college system nearby, and so our student population has grown from about 32,000 to about 52,000 students. So I think it would be interesting to look at some, surely there are some opportunities there to look at some other aspect of student success within a multi-library system. So there are some opportunities there, I think, with the consolidation.
Is there anything either one of you would like to say in closing?
Well, I will probably just say that if you look at higher education, like there is increasing pressure on academic institutions like to demonstrate their worth. Accountability is becoming a major issue, and this will not go away anytime soon. So in fact, the survival of academic units may depend on how well they contribute to institutional mission. So units like academic libraries, I think, need to obviously pay close attention to that. What we have done in this study is to show through a fairly rigorous methodological application how the library contributes to student success. And what I really do hope is that more researchers will move beyond descriptive statistics, because most of the library studies are based on just on descriptive studies. And there is a handful of very interesting studies conducted recently that are moving beyond that. But I do hope that more studies will use much more advanced study design methodology, because it's only through an application of very rigorous and sophisticated methodological design that we will be able to really uncover the impact of academic libraries on student success.
Jennifer, anything you'd like to add in closing?
No, I think that was a great wrap up. The only thing I want to add is that it was a pleasure to work with Feli, and I hope each of you reaches out to your Office of Institutional Research, and perhaps you will be as fortunate as I was to have such a great colleague to work with.
It's been a pleasure working with the library as well. We really enjoy this collaboration between the Office of Institutional Research at Georgia State University and the University Library. I think this model of collaboration is, in fact, one that I would very strongly advocate. So it worked very well for us, and I'm sure it will work for other librarians who are interested in these kind of studies, because each side brings different level of expertise. The library brings domain expertise, the institutional research brings methodological expertise. So the two, a combination of the two expertise, I think would work particularly well.
Excellent. Well, thank you both so much for doing this session today. I think it was really wonderful, and I'm sure that everybody who's going to watch it will share my sentiments. I'm going to go ahead and just put up really quickly again the information that you can use to send questions. There it is, to the web form, and also the email addresses for both of today's authors, Feli and Jennifer. Thanks again to them for this wonderful session, and thanks to all of you for coming today. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.